Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming. It's been wonderful to come up here. I live in York. I live right at the other end of Northumbria. So I've had a lovely day driving up and going to look at excavations at Bamburgh and Lindisfarne, and I'll go and have a look at your trenches after this. What I wanted to do was really give you a sense of trying to think about what are early medieval Northumbrian monasteries like, because I think a lot of people would have been to places like Revo or Fountains or some of the great kind of medieval monasteries, and we used to the idea of big stone churches and square stone cloisters. But the archaeology of early medieval monasteries is very, very different. It's a very different kind of world, and it's worth actually just thinking about what are the kind of things we might be thinking we might find here. Now we're very, very lucky because we are we always talk about the golden age of Northumbria. We are in a golden age right now of archaeology, of people working on the golden age of Northumbria. We're incredibly lucky. There's a whole series of big Northumbrian monastic sites which have been excavated and published. So Whithorn over in Dumfries and Galloway, Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, excavated by Rosemary Cramp at Durham University, one of my colleagues. Excavations at Hartlepool and Hoddam and Port Mahomac up in Scotland, the Isle of May, Inchmarnock. There's loads of excavated monasteries we can start to try and get information from. And also we're literally right now, currently, there is a huge amount of work going on early medieval monasteries. So there's the excavations here. I've come hot foot from Lindisfarne where they're excavating and they look like they're digging up some 10th century burials when I was there. There's recent field work been going on at Hartlepool. Right now there's excavations at Hart, which is just inland from Hartlepool, which is turning out to be a really interesting monastic site. There's been work up at Aberlady, there's work here, there's work looking at the archives of places like Whitby, and archaeologists have only just come back from a new season of excavation at Iona. So there's a huge amount of material, and I think it's probably fair to say there is no other part of Western Europe which has the sheer quantity of archaeology, the sheer existing knowledge which we can draw on when it comes to understanding early medieval Christianity. We're really remarkably lucky. So let's just have a very, very quick think about the history. And this is my one, I'm an archaeologist, not a historian, so this is my one history slide. Obviously, we're in the Anglo-Saxon world, as Harriet's already said. Scotland didn't exist, but of course, England didn't exist either. It's the world of the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and we're here in Bernicia, we're in northern Northumbria, we're in that northern half of Northumbria, and really this greatest Northumbria, as the name suggests, goes from the Humber all the way up to the Forth Clyde line and includes large chunks of the other side of the Pennines and over into western Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway. So at its largest, it was a very, very large kingdom. Also, crucially, it's halfway up Britain. It straddles the kind of Anglo-Saxon world and also reaches into the world of the Picts and the Strathclyde British and the Irish kingdoms of Dalriada that we've already heard about in western Scotland. So we're quite a kind of multicultural area. Now the first Northumbrian king to convert is Edwin, who he's converted by a missionary sent by the Pope. And he converts to Christianity in 627. And very, very importantly, he gets his Christianity directly from Rome, but mediated through the world of the Franks and the great, powerful Kentish kings in southeast England. So he's got a very particular kind of Christian tradition which he converts to. But his successor, Oswald, who, as we heard, spent time over in exile in western Scotland, he converts to the Irish tradition of Christianity. We'll try and avoid the word Celtic, because there's no such thing as a Celtic church, but he does convert to Irish Christianity, which, although they all kind of submit to the Pope and they're all in communion with each other, they do have very different traditions. They celebrate Easter at different times, they have different monastic haircuts and that kind of thing. So we have this situation where Northumbria has two different kinds of Christianity going on at the same time, and also it all gets a bit messy. It gets to the point where the Anglo-Saxon king is feasting at the end of Easter while his queen is still fasting, which is obviously not a recipe for domestic harmony, but also there's bigger political issues at play. It's really about whether Northumbria sees itself as part of the Anglo-Saxon world or really as part of the Irish and Northern world. And in 664, King Oswy at the Synod of Whitby decides to pursue the Roman connections, the Roman and Frankish connections, and the monks and the Irish monks from Lindisfarne and places head off west back to Iona and ultimately to Ireland. So we have Northumbria as a crossroads of this Irish tradition, this Roman tradition, and these Frankish traditions all coming in. Plus, as well as kind of religious traditions, there are wider cultural ebbs and flows of the Irish and the Scots and the Strathclyde Brits and the Picts. So it's a really, really interesting area to look at when it comes to looking at how Christianity emerges. Another thing that's really important to think about is what is a monastery? Because obviously in the pagan world there are no such things as monasteries. Certainly in Northwest Europe there's nothing even resembling a monastery. So it's an entirely new kind of settlement which starts to be set out in the landscape of northern Britain. So a monastery is a group of men or women, and obviously in Coldingham it's a double monastery, following a life of devotion governed by a particular set of rules. By the time you get to the high medieval period, it's really the Benedictine rule which most people follow, and then you get kind of Cistercians and the whole other range of rules coming out of that. But in the early medieval period, most monasteries would follow their own set of guidelines and codes, and they would vary enormously. We're also got to remember we're in a world before parishes and parish churches. The idea of every village having its own church, its own parish, with a parish priest, that's something that only really comes in the 11th and 12th century. Before that, literally the only kind of, certainly in the earlier Middle Anglo-Saxon period, really all churches were monasteries. But there's a huge variation in scale. You get big places like Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow and Lindisfarne where the monks might number in hundreds, to tiny, tiny monasteries with only 2 or 3 monks. Some would be incredibly wealthy, some would be very, very poor. So there's a huge amount of variation in scale and wealth of early medieval monasteries. So that means there's going to be a huge amount of variation in the archaeology of early medieval monasteries. Also, finally, it's important to remember that Christianity is a Mediterranean religion. It's a Mediterranean Near Eastern religion. It grows and develops in a world with towns. And the most important figure in early Christianity, the bishop, in the Mediterranean world, they have their main church in a town. But up here, where we don't have towns, we have a very interesting situation where many big monasteries have both an abbot, or a prior, who looks after the monks, but also may have a bishop as well. So you often get these kind of interesting sets of not one important person, but multiple important people, all based in monasteries. So they're quite complicated beasts. So although there's lots of variation, it's worth thinking about what we do know. And what I want to really try and do is pull out some of the basic features which you can kind of find at most monasteries when we look at them. And if we kind of ignore all the variation, at the very basic level, we'd expect a monastery to have a church or churches, a cemetery or cemeteries. There's going to be residential areas. If you've got monks, they need to live somewhere. They're going to have agriculture and industry, because despite what we read about Cuthbert living off an onion, when you've got lots of monks, they all need feeding. And there's quite a lot of references in Anglo-Saxon histories to people complaining about what a decadent life monks actually lead. So there's the ideal of these ascetic monks living a very, very simple, austere life against the reality of actually often these are very, very wealthy and powerful people. So they have agricultural and industrial stuff. Boundaries, they have defined boundaries. We'll talk about those in a minute. And finally, monasteries don't just sit kind of isolated from the wider world. We tend to believe that with this idea that monks are these very kind of remote, austere individuals who are not part of the wider world. They live in their own monastic life, and generally that's pretty untrue. Most monasteries were situated within a landscape. They were given land by wealthy people. They were the powerful abbots were as politically powerful as any nobleman. They have hinterlands, and we'll look at those. But the basic thing to remember is Anglo-Saxon monasteries are quite big. We tend to think of these little compact monasteries, or even large compact monasteries in the high medieval period. But to give you a sense of a comparison, this is a reconstruction of the Anglo-Saxon monastery of Hartlepool, obviously it's now entirely developed. But probably the monastery covered most of the headland of Hartlepool. When we look at Lindisfarne, for example, we have the high medieval priory, quite a small area. I'm assuming most of you will have been there. You've got where the ruins survive. That's quite a small area. The Anglo-Saxon monastery probably covered the entire village. So these are big, dispersed, diffuse settlements, which bring interesting challenges for us when we try and investigate them as archaeologists. So let's look at some of these things, some of these features, and think what they might actually look like on the ground. Well, obviously churches, that's the key thing we think we need when you have a monastery, because the monks need somewhere to pray, and crucially the key element of Christian life back then is the celebration of the Eucharist, where they go to Mass and they say the prayers over the bread and wine, and that is at the heart of early medieval Christianity. Now, most people will associate, when they think of Anglo-Saxon churches, they'll tend to think of places like maybe Escombe or Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow. They'll tend to think of big stone churches. But the earliest churches we know about are actually probably made out of wood. When Bede talks about the first church built on Lindisfarne, he describes it very clearly. He said it's made after the manner of the Scots. Of course, got to remember when Bede says Scots, he means Irish. It's difficult. He made it not of stone, but entirely of hewn oak, and covered it with reeds. So this is Oswald's great new foundation, and the main church is a wooden building with a thatched roof. So we need to remember these early churches aren't necessarily going to be big stone structures. And we have, the trouble is these wooden structures are not always easy to see archaeologically, because a big stone wall is easier to pick up than lots of small post holes. But we do have examples of probable early wooden churches. At the top is Yevering, the great Anglo-Saxon, best known as a palace site associated with King Edwin, excavated back in the 1950s by Brian Hope Taylor. But there is this small wooden structure, quite late, existed quite late in the chronology of the site, associated with all these burials. And this is almost certainly a church. And I say almost certainly because one of the big challenges we have, it's very, very hard to identify churches unless you find a big piece of stone saying this is a church. When we have if you think our early wooden building, it's a rectangular building, wood, thatched roof, it's not going to look like a church, particularly when we just see it by plan. So we've got to remember that these early churches aren't necessarily terribly easy to pick out. And here is very, very pale slide. This is a site called Spruceton, just known from crop marks down near Coldstream along the Tweed. So again, not a million miles from here. And again, there was what looks like wooden buildings associated with a big cemetery. I'm afraid that's not terribly clear picture. It's only really in the 8th century that we start to see the emergence of stone churches, obviously, so well after the Synod of Whitby. And it's in the 8th century that the idea of building in stone starts to become associated particularly with the Anglo-Saxon church. The Picts and the Irish are doing all sorts of different things. And also it becomes associated with the idea of Romanness, because the Romans built out of stone, and many of the churches south of Hadrian's Wall of this period are actually built out of stone, reused from Roman churches. What's interesting is the kind of architecture starts to get a bit more complicated. So this is, where's that? That's Monk Wearmouth, and you can see, ignore the bit on the left, that's later, but this kind of tower. Now the top of the tower is late Anglo-Saxon, but the bottom is actually a big monumental porch essentially, and these are new kind of architectural features starting to come in, often seemingly influenced by Frankish architectural traditions. You start getting little chambers added on the side. These are called porticus, and these are sometimes used as burial areas or vestries or sanctuaries for the priests. The classic example, of course, one of these early Anglo-Saxon or Middle Anglo-Saxon churches is Escombe down in County Durham, where it's almost, because it's such a poor and remote, relatively speaking, remote place, it was never heavily rebuilt. It was always wheeled out as an example of an 8th century parish church, 8th century Anglo-Saxon church. But how do we date that? You look at it and you go, you suck your teeth and you say, looks a bit Anglo-Saxon. Actually, a lot of our ideas about what Anglo-Saxon church architecture is based on the slenderest lines of evidence. Recent work's been going on suggesting that actually Escombe may date to the middle or later Anglo-Saxon period. Something I've long had my suspicions about, but not the skills to actually work it through in detail. But the recent work in the department has suggested actually it's a bit slightly heretical to suggest it, but Escombe may be a little bit later than it's always been suggested. But this is a problem. So often what we think we know is actually based on very, very limited amounts of evidence. The other thing to remember is that we always think of monasteries having just one big church in the centre. But Anglo-Saxon monasteries, and more generally monasteries in northern Britain, they certainly have a main church, but actually they have multiple churches spread across their entire enclosure. So this is Iona on the right. Obviously this is the later medieval abbey. There's an abbey church there, but there's other churches dotted, there's one I missed just there, all around the site. There's multiple churches. This is the great Irish monastery, Clonmacnoise in County Offaly. And again, there's 6 or 7 churches spread across this entire enclosure. So just because you can't dig one church, because for example here, probably the main Anglo-Saxon church is probably under your later parish church, the later priory church, doesn't mean there may not be other churches elsewhere that could be picked up through careful archaeological excavation and fieldwork. So just because you can't get to your main church doesn't mean there aren't other ones to be examined. And they probably varied in function. We know, for example, on Lindisfarne, one church was entirely for the use of women. Other places you may have churches dedicated to particular saints, where masses were celebrated on a particular day. On Iona, one of the churches seems to be particularly associated with burial. So churches would have had multiple different functions. As well as having lots of churches, Anglo-Saxon monasteries would also have had multiple cemeteries. Obviously, when you think about it, there are many different communities and groups using a monastery. You have the monks themselves. Something like double monastery, you'll have monks and nuns. And it's unlikely they would be buried in the same cemetery. You're probably going to have separate cemeteries. And when Bede writes about Lindisfarne, he talks about there being a cemetery for the brothers. And by implication, that means there's cemeteries for other people as well. So when we've been excavating, when I've been working with dig ventures down on Holy Island, we found early medieval burials. And when we started to look at the bone, what's interesting is amongst all our nice burials, we've got remains of children. We've got remains of 6-year-old. Now, you could just about be a monk at 6. I think Bede joins the monastery at Monk Weymouth and Jarrow, I think it's the age of 6 or 7. But we've also got younger children, we've even got a neonate, a newly born child, or just at the point of birth. And that's clearly not a monk. So I think what we're excavating is probably a cemetery associated with a secular population. Now that might be the people who live on the island. It might be people coming to the island on pilgrimage. We don't know, but one of the things we hopefully will be able to do in Lindisfarne is use isotopic analysis of the bone chemistry. We'll be able to tell whether people grew up locally or whether they may have come from elsewhere. So a big Anglo-Saxon cemetery excavated at Bamborough, just across the way from Lindisfarne, about half the people from Bamborough Cemetery at Bamborough came from Western Scotland. So you can use the science to tell us where people are coming from. On Anglo-Saxon monasteries, we also find lots of different burial rites going on. So, for example, I know from previous excavations here at Coldingham and on Lindisfarne and multiple other Anglo-Saxon sites in the north, you have this practice of putting quartz pebbles on graves. And that's something you don't find in Wessex, you don't find down in East Anglia, but very much a kind of northern British thing. It's not even a Northumbrian thing, it's a northern Northumbrian thing, and you find it up into the picture world and up into Scotland, and also you find it in Ireland. So we find that associated with some graves. Other graves have stone linings around them. Not all of them, some of them do. So there's lots of variation in the way in which people are actually being buried. For example, grave markers. Now, most Anglo-Saxon graves don't have grave markers, but it's clear that some do. So, for example, Lindisfarne, this is the one we found a couple of years ago. It's a very, very broken example, but it's a lovely little carved stone, and there's a name there, which is Itfrith, or Itfrid, and that's probably the name of the person who's buried. So very small, they're not like big modern grave, or big like a post-medieval gravestones. They're quite small, but they're clearly naming an individual. And you find similar ones down at Hartlepool. And this is from an excavation that I mentioned, an excavation going on at the moment in Hart. That was found in earlier work there last year. So they do come up with little burial markers, but they're not common, and they very much seem to be associated with monastic cemeteries. Also, we tend to think of like once a cemetery becomes a cemetery, it stays a cemetery. You know, out there, people have been buried for 800, 900, 1,000 years. Often Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, they come in and go out of use fairly regularly. So I was involved in writing up excavations at Whithorn, Dumfries and Galloway, a big Northumbrian monastery and the home of a Northumbrian bishop. There, in one area, we had a cemetery which came into being, then fell out of use and became a metalworking area. More burials, more craft and industry, more burials, then some houses were put up, then there's some more burials, and it cycled through this thing of being a cemetery and not being a cemetery over about 6 times over a period of about 500 years. So cemeteries can appear and disappear over the life of a monastery. So it's not the idea of having consecrated ground permanently being consecrated and never being used for anything else is something we need to be watch out for. Now, of course, I've kind of got this bit kind of head around, face around tail here, because really I've talked about what happens to the dead people. What I've not done is talked about the living people. Monasteries obviously need to house your monks. Someone like Lindisfarne would have had several hundred monks. Coldingham, not as many, but still, a good, maybe 50, 60, and that's plucking a number out the air there. They would need accommodation, they'd need buildings to live in, they need accommodation for the work they're doing. So it's not just actually the houses, but where they do things like make the Lindisfarne Gospel, that kind of thing. They need buildings. Now, one of the really important things to understand about Anglo-Saxon architecture is, although they start using stone for churches by the 7th, 8th century, that is the only thing they use stone for. Stone masonry is very much kept purely for churches until essentially the Norman period. Everything else is built out of wood. And this trying to pick up the remainder of wooden buildings can be very tricky. Now, sometimes it's nice and easy. This is from Hartlepool, where there's lots of excavations on the cemetery, and here they've got nice big slots into which the wooden beams would have been put. There's 2 rectangular buildings kind of overlying each other, great big post holes, possibly for things like doors and internal fittings. That's, if only life was always that simple. Mm-hmm. Actually, more often the structures are much harder to see. Here's another example of a building from Hartlepool. Literally all you have are a series of stones laid very crudely in a rectangular shape. And these aren't stone buildings. What these are stone pads on which a wooden timber would have been placed, and the stones would have kept it dry so it wouldn't rot. So it's very, very hard to pick things up. When we were excavating at Lindisfarne last year, again we've got probable corner of one of these wooden buildings, but they're not very, very easy to see. So those of you who are excavating, those of you actually out on site, you need to where even the most ephemeral little line of stones has the potential of becoming something structural. So don't trowel too enthusiastically. Make sure you don't kind of remove. You don't want to find an Anglo-Saxon building when it's on the spoil heap. You actually want to find it in the trench. But obviously, I mentioned there's a lot of regional variations and traditions. So, for example, this is Iona, very much an Irish-influenced monastery, obviously associated with Columba. Now, the life of St. Columba was written by a monk called Andovnan, and he talks about there being a magna domus, literally a big house, which seems to have been a communal living area. At Hartlepool, you see our let's go back, our relatively small structures. They aren't very big, good-sized garden shed, one of those things. They're probably the cells for individual monks. But on Iona we have this reference to a big communal building. And hopefully you can just about see the series of post settings in a big circle, or part of the circle. So in that part of Scotland, the Irish influence, it seems that even in the medieval period, they're still building large circular houses, like the type we tend to associate more with the Iron Age and prehistory. So these things, there's a huge amount of variation. There's one exception to what I was saying about stone building being reserved for to churches, and that's Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow. Now, Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, both this great monastery founded by Benedict Biscop. He was a Northumbrian monk who was really keen on links with Rome. He went to Rome several times. He brought back masons and artists and glassmakers from the continent to help build this great monastery. And this is really the one monastery of Anglo-Saxon days in the north where they do actually seem to have used stone buildings to house the monks. So as well as the church itself, hopefully you can see here the plan, Jarrow, you've got the church at the top, and then a parallel row of buildings to the south, which are presumably the homes and the refectory and the dormitory of the monks. And we see a similar kind of situation in Jarrow. I wouldn't expect this is the kind of thing we would find in Coldingham. It'd be wonderful if you did, but I expect it's more likely someone like Coldingham, the kind of buildings we'd be finding are those very simple but quite ephemeral structures. Though one thing I've learned about having been in archaeology for a long time now is that never try and predict anything, because sites always surprise you. Agricultural industry, as I said, you need to get away from the idea that these are kind of poor monks. It's someone like Lindisfarne, the poor monks, they created something like the Lindisfarne Gospels, which involves a huge amount of wealth to create something like the Lindisfarne Gospels. You need all the pigments, you need the learning, the book learning behind it, which means the ability to access other manuscripts and other books. Even the very parchment, the vellum on which it's written, implies a huge amount of wealth, because they are using only the very best calf skins. So you would need 50, 100 calves to be slaughtered purely to make the vellum for something like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Now Bede, in a very interesting line, he says about something like Lindisfarne, it was wealthy not in gold, but wealthy in cattle. And remember in the early medieval world, one of the great units of wealth, a way of measuring wealth, was how many cows you owned. And certainly if you go and look at early medieval Ireland at this time, the entire economy was predicated on how many cows people actually possessed. It wasn't so much about wealth, about gold, it's about your wealth in terms of livestock. And think about kind of tribes in kind of East Africa today, where for them it's all about how much your livestock is worth. So these are big monasteries, very, very wealthy. Also, they're given huge amounts of land, a way for an Anglo-Saxon noble to get favour with a monastery, to get them to pray for him, maybe to get them to let him be buried there when he died, is by gifting land. So someone like Lindisfarne, more or less, when you stand on Lindisfarne and look towards the mainland, everything you can see on the mainland belongs to Lindisfarne. And then everything up the Tweed, as far as Coldstream, belongs to Lindisfarne. And then loads of sites, loads of estates, all the way up here, all the way up to the Forth, belong to Lindisfarne. Most of County Durham belongs to Lindisfarne. Bits of Yorkshire belong to Lindisfarne. It is a massive, it's not multinational, but it's like a huge corporation. It's incredibly powerful. When you think about all the other monasteries, again, with all their huge estates. And often these estates can be at a considerable distance away from the monastery itself. So one of the first blocks of land which was given to Lindisfarne, for example, is actually a whole series of estates up near Kirk Yetton, right up on the Beaumont Water. It's not the land immediately adjacent, it's up in the hills. And that's partly because it's probably very good grazing pasture in summer for the great monastic herds of cows. So these are only huge amounts of territory. And we might expect to find that on the sites themselves. So for example, this is an excavation of a site called Hoddon in Dumfries. And here is only scratched the surface, but this structure here big kind of stone surrounding wall, and a big circular thing. That is a grain dryer. It's a drain dryer, a grain dryer, for parching the grain before grinding it to make flour. That's a big one, and there's several. So these are monasteries which clearly have a lot of grain coming in to be processed. And we know from a lot of the Irish references to monasteries of this period that as well as the monks themselves, they would often have many labourers who worked for them and would be essentially living in or around the monastery and also out on its outlying estates. So there's lots of agricultural wealth. There's also the production of things like metal, obviously tools, so ironworking goes on these sites, and also things like the kind of reliquaries, the ornate bindings on the outside of gospel books, all that kind of metalworking, all that kind of high-end luxury good production is also taking place on monasteries. We know from places like Iona and Hartlepool, where we found that the moulds of little bits of really high status metalwork, that's where it's going on. So these are, a big monastery, it owns huge amounts of land, has hundreds of monks and labourers, it's producing and processing agricultural surplus, cattle and grain, it's producing iron, it's producing high status metalwork. These are in a world without towns, these are the nearest thing to an urban centre that you get in northern Britain in the early medieval period. The final thing to think about is boundaries. Arguably, you could find a lot of these other things on other kinds of sites. So we have residential buildings on secular sites, palace sites. We have ironwork and agricultural production on all sorts of other sites. One of the key things about monasteries, and one of the things that was so important about the way in which space was kind of laid out, is the role of the boundary. Sometimes you see this word vallum being used. And the idea that the monastic vallum or boundary, which went around the outside of the site, that was really important because that defined and separated the secular and the profane world on the outside from the holy world on the inside. And often monasteries would have things like rights to give people sanctuary if they came within the monastic boundary. And we see this idea of the vallum being such an important feature of monasteries, coming in all sorts of ways. This is a quote from the Collectio Canonum Hybenensis, which is an Irish or possibly kind of Western Scottish, though there's not much difference in the sense, a set of law codes for monastic life in the 8th century. And it talks about how a monastery should have 2 or 3 termini, which in this context means a boundary around the holy place. So the first which no one is allowed to enter at all except the priests, and women aren't allowed near it unless they're nuns, and that's where you'd have your main church, perhaps your main relics. And then you have multiple series of boundaries, and as you go through the boundaries you get processed through the site, getting closer and closer to the holy part of the site. And we have things like this. This is from a little late 8th century gospel book with some other bits and pieces mixed up with it. It's called the Book of Mulling. And you can just about see there's a kind of sketch plan of what a monastery ought to look like. And we have a boundary very clearly shown. Now often these monastic boundaries, when people think about them, they think about places like Iona. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Iona, but Iona has a huge, big boundary. You can see it at the top there, that big grey line running across that field. That's where it survives as a crop mark, and then as you come round, it survives as an earthwork, and it comes all the way down here and probably comes across somewhere like that. So again, you can, apart from anything, you can see how big an early medieval monastery is compared to the little later medieval monastery kind of huddling in the middle. This is, I'm not sure how well you can see it, this is a site called Fortingall up in Perthshire, and again, we know we've got this big boundary surrounding the church itself, which is this little thing here. So a lot of these sites, apart from anything, these monastic sites spread out into the landscape, well away from their church. So that's the kind of thing people tend to think about when they think about monastic vallum. They tend to think about these huge, big ditches, big banks. It's not always the case. I mean, one of the interesting things about Iona is that boundary actually has its origins in the Iron Age. It's a reused Iron Age enclosure. So it wasn't actually laid out by the monks. It was reused by the monks at a later date. So we have it's not actually, doesn't necessarily mean that all monastic boundaries are like that. The trouble is, again, it's one of these things where archaeologists have got it into their head that that's what they'd expect to find. This is a plan of the excavations at Whiphorn in Dumfries and Galloway. And the first excavator who did fantastic, this is not a criticism at all, did a very, very good job excavating it. But when he was writing it up, because he was expecting to find a big monastic boundary, he joined together some very tiny stretches of ditch to make a monastic boundary. So if you look at this big, you see this outer boundary which he's drawn, the slightly lighter shade of blue. If you actually look at the area he's actually excavated to find his boundary, that whole perimeter is based on that. And the earlier one, the inner one, is based on not much more. But actually, when you can see a trench, that's a long trench there, that was excavated after he wrote and published his first excavations. And what's interesting, his predicted enclosure, you could actually, when it was excavated, it didn't come up at all. Mm-hmm. It wasn't there. So actually, you see how what people expect to find sometimes affects how they interpret. And actually we know from documentary sources, for example, St Wilfrid's Monastery at Oundle in Northamptonshire was probably seems to have been bounded by a hedge. And the place name Bangor, which you got to get in Northern Ireland and North West Wales, associated with monastic sites, literally means wattle enclosure. So we're not necessarily, when we're looking for a boundary, we don't have to be finding a big ditch. I mean, they may well have big ditches, and also a big monastery would probably have multiple interior boundaries as well, because you've got lots of cattle and sheep wandering around. You don't want them kind of getting into the church, so you have to have boundaries and fences and all sorts of things. But it doesn't even a really important boundary like a vallum doesn't have to be big. It's the symbolism that's important. So it might simply be marked by a hedge, or simply by a couple of stone crosses at points where roads come in. It's a symbolic line. The thing I always think about, I'm not sure whether you've ever come across it in North London, where in Hampstead, where there's a big Jewish community, they have an area marked out for kind of ritual purposes where they can, the things they can do on a Sabbath are slightly different from normal. And that's literally marked by a wire, or like a string which goes from lampposts around the area, because the important bit is the symbolism, not necessarily the huge physical material bulk of that boundary. So it's worth remembering, I mean here you've got no shortage of ditches. You're lucky, you have plenty of ditches here. The ditches are all, but the best thing about ditches on an Anglo-Saxon site is they have stuff in them. I think that's more interesting from an archaeological perspective. All the rubbish ends up being put into ditches. That's why I get excited by ditches. It's not that they necessarily mean a big boundary. Think about hinterland. I've already talked a little bit about this. The sheer size of monastic estates. This is a map. You see Holy Island there, and we have monasteries had kind of two kinds of hinterland. They spread out to the surrounding area. In one sense, they have an economic hinterland, so the land they own, and often they'll have farms and estates. And from later medieval documentary evidence, we know that there's this big chunk of land opposite Holy Island, more or less from Boodle Bay and Bamburgh down here up to Berwick and inland along the crest of the Sandstone Ridge. That's an area later known as Islandshire, which we know belongs to Lindisfarne. And using later medieval documents, we can actually home in and actually know that almost all these places here, don't worry about the different kind of dots, but these are all places mentioned in later medieval documents, and that's probably small estates all belonging to Holy Island. There was a similar pattern of estates running along Norham, up to Northumbria, running along the Tweed. And sometimes you have the evidence for these. I'll talk a little bit about how we know about these a little bit later. Other cases, we just know that a monastery was established by monks from a larger monastery. So monks from Iona established Lindisfarne, and Lindisfarne itself establishes daughter monasteries and has dependencies. So we have a kind of economic estates and all these dependent religious houses. As I said, with a place like Lindisfarne, they have very, very, very large areas of influence. I want to take a step back and think a little bit about how do we know what we know about early medieval monasteries? Because I've already hinted, often we have ideas of what we think we know, but actually when you go back, the evidence isn't always terribly strong. One of the problems we have, and one of the strengths we have, and one of the problems we have when it comes to looking at early medieval monasteries is Bede. Bede is a fantastic source. He writes the history of early medieval Northumbrian monasticism. He has quite a jaundiced view. He's not interested in British Christianity. He kind of likes Irish Christianity, but they're still not quite up to snuff. But really what he likes is good Roman-influenced Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow style Christianity. So he writes a lot, but he's coming from a very partial perspective. And crucially, he then dies, which means our key source for early medieval monasticism in Northumbria disappears in the middle of the 8th century. But we tend to try and cram everything we know through Bede. And Bede mentions some monasteries, so we tend to look for the monasteries which Bede mentions. What is important is actually to start using other documentary sources, and something people are starting to do. For example, one of the great advantages of Lindisfarne and the community in Cuthbert is they wrote a lot. So we have later histories like the Historia Sanctae Cuthbertae and the work of the Norman historian Simeon of Durham. He actually mentions all sorts of really interesting stuff. But no matter what people think about archaeologists, most of us don't read Latin. It's only been in the last 20 years where a lot of this stuff has actually been translated into English. I do have colleagues in the department who do read Latin. I don't read 10th century Latin, I'm afraid. As more of these documents are becoming more available, we're suddenly realising there are other ways to think about the monasteries. And it's not purely what Bede says goes. Even sites which are mentioned by Bede often only get the briefest of references. So Hartlepool, if we tried to plot the history of Hartlepool, it would be a monastery founded relatively early and then completely kind of disappears as the new monastery at Whitby is founded. Actually, we know from the archaeology that Hartlepool keeps on going well after Whitby is established, but you never know that if you just purely read Bede. And also, the site of Hart, which is 3 miles away from Hartlepool, not mentioned at all, but clearly, as we're finding from archaeology, quite an important monastic site in its own right. So we've got to be a little bit careful about you relying on the historical texts. There are lots of ways we can identify sites. One of the great things about the archaeology up here is we have lots and lots of early medieval sculpture. And that is really good because the only people who are making early medieval sculpture in this period are church people. And generally speaking, I'm not going to be having sculpture unless it's close or in a church. The occasional boundary marker, the occasional preaching cross. But what's clear is most of this stuff is actually coming from churches. So this is a map, a very rough and ready map, which shows all the location of all the crosses known, or all early medieval stone sculpture known from, broadly speaking, from Northumbria. There's more dots to put in the West Dumfries and Galloway. I didn't have time to do that before I came here. But it gives you a sense of all the number of sites which might be early medieval monastic. The ones in black are the ones Bede mentions. So you realise that Bede mentions perhaps 5% of the probable known monasteries overall in Northumbria. So most monasteries probably never recorded in the documentary sources. And Coldingham, you're lucky, crops up multiple times. And many of these sites are entirely mute unless we use the archaeology. So we know that there are probably a lot more monastic sites than we like to think, and many are never recorded in documentary sources. So how do we approach these sites if you want to go and dig them? Now, in an ideal world, you tend to think, the thing to do is we'll home in on the church. Now, obviously, one of the big problems is churches tend to stay in use. So if you try digging a hole in the churchyard, you would not find you might find an Anglo-Saxon monastery, but you have to go for an awful lot of bodies to get there. The interior of churches tend to be chopped up by medieval and post-medieval crypts and burial plots interior. So we tend to be able to get to monasteries round the edge. So these are some of our early trenches on Holy Island from our first year. You can see we could try and dig a hole in the middle of the monastery, but what we would find is lots and lots of later medieval material. So we tend to be looking at monasteries round the edges, and precisely what we've got going on somewhere like this. We can't get into a churchyard, but we can get into those surrounding areas. But it doesn't matter too much, because these are very, very big monasteries. So it doesn't matter that we can't get into the heart of them, but we can still get into quite large, important areas nonetheless using archaeology. So just very, very quickly look at a couple of these other sites, which are not necessarily known by documentary sources, which aren't necessarily as important to someone like Lindisfarne, and just try to think about what the kind of archaeology is actually like. Just see them down in County Durham. As the name suggests, it's close to the sea. Luckily, it's a rare example of an Anglo-Saxon church where there's actually Anglo-Saxon fabric built into the church, probably from 9th, 10th century rather than 7th, 8th century, but clearly an indicator of importance. It's mentioned very briefly as an estate belonging to the monks of Community of St Cuthbert's. But when excavation's been going on in recent years, people have found burials right up at the top there. So good kind of 150, 200 metres away from the little medieval church. So even a small monastery where we have very little evidence for a big settlement. Even the burials, remember we've had multiple cemeteries, can be a good 150, 200 yards away. So even small sites might be physically quite large. They're not going to be very important, but they'll be quite dispersed. And between them, there's large areas of occupation evidence, kind of ditches and pits starting to come up, and they've been seen in various times through community archaeological excavations. So a little site which you wouldn't think barely gets a mention, and frankly the only reason anyone's ever done any archaeology there at all is because of the Anglo-Saxon stuff surviving in the church. Another interesting site is Gainford, and Gainford is down right down the River Tees down in County Durham. It does get a mention. It gets a mention in AD 800. That somebody, one of the abbots of Lindisfarne, gives this estate to become a monastery. What's interesting about Gainford, though, is even though we know it's a monastery, even though we know it was attached to the monks of monks of the Community of St Cuthbert, there is no Anglo-Saxon sculpture there. There's loads of Viking sculpture, but for the time when we know it's an Anglo-Saxon monastery, there is no sculpture at all. So when you think back to my map of dots, if those are all the places which have built sculpture, we now have to think about the possibility that there's Anglo-Saxon monasteries which have no sculpture at all. So you wonder how many other dots we could put on that map. And I know probably about at least 10 other sites which are probably Anglo-Saxon monasteries but haven't produced any sculpture of the right period. But again, Gainford is a place where the enclosure was clearly once much larger. There's a church there with a little graveyard around it, but archaeologists and antiquarians have found graves up on the village green. Some stone sculpture, admittedly a later date, has been found in this area here, and actually this big kind of sausage-shaped area within the on the north bank of the River Tees. None of the buildings within that are medieval. They're all post-medieval. It looks like the main village was kind of up along the main road, and probably what we had was what was once a large enclosure which has shrunk down to just where the parish church was. So again, the site barely gets a mention, but actually quite interesting archaeology. A bit more close to home, Tilmouth, up in Northumberland. Well, down in Northumberland from here, aren't we? I'm so used to teaching in Durham, we have to stay up in Northumberland. Tilmouth, now that's interesting. Tilmouth, the site mentioned in some of those Norman histories. It's mentioned as being one of the mansiones of Lindisfarne, as in it's a possession of Lindisfarne. And it's listed along with a whole series of other sites, Melrose, Abercorn, Coldingham, Norham and Tunningham. And most of those sites have produced Anglo-Saxon sculpture, which kind of got me wondering about Tilmouth, because nobody ever actually mentioned Tilmouth. Of course, the great thing about Tilmouth is it's really easy to locate, because it's at the mouth of the River Till. And if only Anglo-Saxons would name their place names more consistently than that, make life a lot easier. But if you actually go out and have a look at the site, well, that little structure there, that's the Chapel of St Cuthbert. It's mainly Victorian, but there's clearly an older chapel there. And then there are actually crop marks, which I've plotted them in because they're not on this photo, of what looks like a large enclosure kind of cutting off the monastery, again with the river on the north side. So again, typical monastic location with up against the edge of a river. So probably we've got another monastery there. But that shows that no one had thought of looking there. I mean, it's such an obvious site. I can't believe no one actually thought of looking there, but there's a good evidence there's probably an Anglo-Saxon monastery there. Carham, again, very important year, Battle of Carham, 1,000 years ago. Probably the point on which the Scottish border and Scottish independence is always kind of hung on. Down on the river, down on the Tweed, and again, you can see that the Tweed here, it's the site of the current parish church of Carham. Here's a churchyard. Now this is a LiDAR plot, so it's topographic imagery based on firing lasers at the ground. It gives you very, very detailed topographic imagery. And you can see all this corrugated stuff. That's medieval ridge and furrow. But look, because underneath it, there's this big circular enclosure. And it's got to be earlier than ridge and furrow, because ridge and furrow goes over it. So we've got a big circular enclosure around a known Anglo-Saxon church, because the Historia Sancti Cuthberto references it being given to the monastery of Lindisfarne, all waiting there to be discovered. And these are just things I've found in my research. So I think the important thing is there's lots of these sites out there. We're barely scratching the surface. But we tend to look at the big sites. We tend to look at the sites mentioned by Bede. There's actually a lot of ground we've got from actually exploring these little sites, actually going and seeing what's on the ground. So we've got a huge resource of archaeological material up in this part of the country, which people are barely looking at. So we're going to finish now, but key questions I want you to think about, and particularly those of you on site. Chronology. Again, we tend to rely on texts and think that everything finishes when the text says it finishes. So here, the Vikings destroy it in 870. Lindisfarne, everyone leaves in 875, according to the texts. But of course they don't, because all the sculptures post 875, there's 10th century burials at Lindisfarne. So we know people are staying there. So as an archaeologist, I would say this as an archaeologist, don't believe the texts all the time. The texts are telling a particular story they want you to hear. It's clear on Lindisfarne that there are people staying there after everyone's meant to have left. It's the same story at Iona, where everyone's meant to have left because of the Vikings. So Coldingham, don't assume it all stops in 870. You may well have stuff here filling that gap between 870 and the re-establishment of the Priory, because that's exactly what we have at Lindisfarne. Also, find me bone. Find me animal bone, find me human bone. Because that'll tell us so much about the economy and the society. And as I said, with bone isotopes, we can see where people came from, we can see where cattle came from. So one of my colleagues at Durham, using those techniques on a site down in West Yorkshire, different period, an Iron Age site, but looks like the bone, the animal bone, the cattle were being drove down from Scotland, Scottish Highlands. So in the Iron Age, people are moving cattle 200-300 miles across down to West Yorkshire. We know the monks have estates all over the place. So maybe that we can pick up, don't assume just because you've got a cow here, it came from that field. It could have come from 100 miles away. So with the techniques we now have, can tell us a huge amount about the things, much more than just whether it's a cow or not. There's so much more we can unpack from the environmental evidence. So I'll leave it there. This is just my perspective, slightly ranty perspective. It kind of shows what I think the potential of archaeology. And let's not get bogged down with what Bede says. Let's not get bogged down with the text. Let's treat archaeology as something which produces its own set of arguments and its own set of data. So go out and find me stuff from the 9th century. Find me some 9th and 10th century cows. That would be ideal. So hopefully that's your mission. Thank you very much.